This is a true story. I've made only a few tiny little changes to protect the privacy of the people involved. And I wrote it all out just because there are bits that I don't want to forget. Okay? So this is a story about a scary medical situation that happened to a friend of mine a few years ago. At the same time, it's a story about the nature of human intelligence, about the organization of the human brain, and about the ability, or lack thereof, of the brain to repair itself after damage. It's also a story about denial, mine, and about dumb luck and extreme privilege, my friend's, and about extraordinary expertise, my friend's doctor. Okay, here goes. So a bunch of years ago, an old friend of mine stayed over at my house en route to a conference in a neighboring state. I'd known this guy, I'll call him Bob, for many, many years. We went on hiking trips together, we did lots of stuff together. We were pretty close. We talked all the time. So Bob stays over at my house, and early the next morning, as I'm only quasi-awake, I hear him packing in the adjacent room to head off to drive to his conference. And after a fair amount of shuffling, I hear a sudden crash. I go into his room to see what happened, and I see Bob lying on the floor. I say, "Bob," and there's no answer. I say, "Bob," and there's no answer. And I dial 911. As we're waiting for the ambulance to arrive, Bob starts to wake up. He's a little disoriented, but more or less coherent. So neither he nor I can figure out what happened. The ambulance arrives surprisingly fast, and all these EMTs rush up to the upstairs bedroom where he was staying. And they ask him a bunch of questions, and they take his vitals, and they can't find anything seriously wrong. So we discuss what to do. And everyone's calm about it. Nobody seems alarmed. And they say, well, we could take him to the ER, as if I'm supposed to figure that out. How the hell would I know? But eventually we decide that we sort of need to know what happened, even if he seems okay now. But also we don't need to use the ambulance, and I can drive him, because there's a hospital, Mount Auburn Hospital, less than a half a mile from my house. So we let the EMTs go, and I drive Bob to the Mount Auburn emergency room. So at this point, Bob feels a little woozy, but he seems basically okay. So we're now panicking. We check in at the ER, and they do a whole bunch of tests. They don't find anything wrong, but they want to keep him to do a few more tests just to be sure. So after an hour or so of this, with them not finding anything wrong, I figure I have work to do, he's probably fine, and I head off to work. Before leaving, I say to the ER doc that he might want to consider whether this might have something to do with Bob's brain. I mentioned that I've actually been worrying for a few years about Bob's navigational abilities. They seemed markedly worse than they used to be. Now, this was an understatement. One time, about a year before, Bob was giving directions to a friend of mine on how to get from his house to the town where Bob worked, a route that he drove pretty much every day. He said, "You pull out of the driveway and turn left." The friend and I looked at each other and said, "What? Which way?" And Bob thought again and said, "Left." This is a route Bob had driven almost every day for the last several years. His directions were exactly backwards. When I heard him insist on this patently wrong answer, a sickening feeling of dread came over me. In fact, several incidents like that had happened over the previous couple of years. One time, Bob was driving around his hometown with a friend of mine, and the friend later told me, "What's up with Bob? He didn't seem to have any idea how to get from one place to another in his hometown." At the same time, Bob was successfully holding down a demanding, high-powered job, and he seemed totally on the ball. He was the life of the party, always making witty remarks. Everyone liked him. Nobody suspected any problems. It was just his ability to get from one place to another that had vanished. Now, Bob had never been that great at navigation. On hiking trips he and I had taken many years before, I would grab the map away from him and say, "Don't even bother. I can do this better than you." He could get by, I was just a lot better. There are individual differences in navigational ability, as we'll discuss later in the course. He could manage, it just wasn't great. But what was going on now was a totally different order of magnitude. Now he just had no idea where anything was or how to get from A to B. If he didn't have GPS on his phone, he wouldn't be able to function at all. So something was obviously very, very wrong. So the few times that I actually thought about it, I became terrified about the possible implications. Did Bob have early Alzheimer's? Did he have a brain tumor? But how could either of those things be, given that he was still his super smart self, still writing beautiful prose, entertaining everyone with his wit, functioning at a very demanding, fancy job? He just didn't seem like somebody who had something wrong with his brain. The possibility just seemed too implausible and frankly too frightening to take seriously. The killer thing about this is that I, if anyone, should have known better. The central idea of my research for many years has been that different parts of the brain do different things, and that some of those functions are very specific. And that means that it's possible to lose one very specific function, like navigation, without losing other mental abilities. So it is some very weird kind of blindness or denial or dysfunction on my part that as I watched Bob lose his navigational abilities, I didn't connect the dots. But now that we were there in the ER with some unexplained problem, things clicked, and I told the ER doc about Bob's navigational abilities. I suggested that they consider there might be something wrong with his brain. But the ER doc said immediately, with the confidence you can only find in MDs, nope, this is not a brain thing, this is a heart thing. Well, that wasn't exactly comforting. But in any case, Bob seemed okay for the moment, and I had work to do. So I told him to call me if there was news, and I took off. We talked a few times during the day. They still hadn't found anything wrong. But then that night, I got a call. Bob said, they just did an MRI, and they found something in my brain. I rushed to the car, and in the short drive to the hospital, I called my amazing lab tech, and I said, my friend Bob is in trouble. There's something in his brain. And I remember that we scanned him for an experiment in the lab quite a few years ago. Can you please dig through our terribly disorganized data files and see if you can find those anatomical MRIs that would show pictures of the anatomy of his brain? When I arrived in the hospital, the MRI technician showed both me and Bob what they had found in his MRI images. There was a huge mass the size of a lime right in the middle of Bob's brain. Actually, it was just behind the middle of his brain, right where I should have expected it, right next to a brain region that my lab had discovered that's very involved in navigation. In that work, my then postdoc, Russell Epstein, had been interested in how we recognize complex real-world scenes. Russell had a background in computer vision, and he really wanted to study the computations that go on in the mind and brain when you recognize a scene. Russell used computational methods, modeling vision with computers, and behavioral methods, testing people with simple behavioral experiments to try to figure out how vision works. Measuring behavior in this way is a venerable and classic method in our field, which has led to many deep discoveries. But just at the time when Russell had started working in my lab, functional MRI had just burst on the scene, and we were all just wildly excited about the fact that we could watch little parts of the human brain turn on and off as people did different kinds of things. So I said to Russell, brain imaging is hot, and you need to get a job, so you need to do just one brain imaging experiment. Russell balked at this total non-idea of an experiment, objecting that my motives were shallow and tactical and not scientifically principled. He was absolutely right. But I convinced him anyway that he should just scan people while they were looking at scenes, stupid as that sounded, so that he could flash it up in a job talk and show people that he knew how to do a brain imaging experiment. Sometimes you have to be a little bit practical. So Russell does that. He runs this experiment. It's totally simple-minded. He shows people pictures of scenes while he scans their brains with functional MRI. We'll talk more about it later. And what he finds knocks our socks off. He finds this little patch of brain right near the center of the brain near a region called the parahippocampal gyrus that responds like crazy when people were looking at scenes and responds very little when they look at pretty much anything else. It was totally unexpected. It blew us away, and it set us on a whole saga, and Russell never looked back, and he's now a very famous cognitive neuroscientist teaching at UPenn, and we'll read a bunch of the very cool papers from his lab in a month or so. So we named that region the parahippocampal place area because it's in parahippocampal cortex, and it responds very strongly when you look at pictures of places. So when I saw that big line in Bob's brain, I had an immediate sense of recognition. Of course, the Lyme was right next to the parahippocampal place area, and another region right near it called retrosplenial cortex, which is also implicated in navigation. It all made perfect sense. But how horrifying, too. Brain cancers generally grow very fast, have bad outcomes, and this looked like very bad news indeed. Further, how would you even get at this tumor surgically if that was what it was to come to, without damaging all the overlying tissue, which is in visual cortex back here? But then I remembered that we had that data on how fast this thing was growing. By then, my trusty lab tech had already found and emailed me the anatomical images of Bob's brain from 4 or 5 years before. I pulled up the images on my computer as we sat in the MRI waiting room. And I found that little blob in the same place in his brain. It was a bunch smaller then, but it was clearly the same thing in the same place. Maybe the size of a large grape, something like that. That was, on the one hand, really poignant. Had I just looked more carefully at the anatomical images, which I don't usually do, we use them for other reasons in our studies. Had I seen it way back 4 or 5 years before, it probably would have been much easier to deal with. On the other hand, it was good news, because the worst brain tumors usually grow really fast. And the fact that the thing had only grown a bit in 4 or 5 years suggested that it was very slow growing and maybe not the worst kind of brain cancer. Indeed, the docs told us that they suspected this was something called meningioma, which is not actually cancer at all. It would still have to be removed, which would be no small thing, but it probably wasn't malignant. So that night, I lay awake trying to use my woefully inadequate knowledge of neuroanatomy to try to visualize how you could reach this thing and whether you'd have to go through overlying brain tissue to get to it. There was an amusing moment the next day when I was talking to one of the residents who came by Bob's hospital room. I told him about Bob's navigational deficits and mentioned that I happened to be a neuroscientist who'd worked on a region nearby in the brain that might be relevant. The resident smiled and said, "We know who you are." That afternoon, I discussed Bob's situation with a neurosurgeon friend of mine who told me, "It is of paramount importance that you find the right surgeon to do this surgery. It could make the difference between whether Bob dies on the table or goes on to live a normal life." Okay, noted. So I scrambled for the next few weeks to find and exploit every thin connection I have to neurosurgeons and medicine to try to find the best possible neurosurgeon to perform the very risky surgery required to remove Bob's tumor. And due to great privilege, connections, and luck, we found an amazingly skilled surgeon who specialized in just this kind of surgery, and we scheduled the event. So the night before the surgery, I decided to try to test Bob's navigational abilities more carefully, to try to better understand the exact nature of his deficit. This is the classic original method used to study the human brain. It's been going on for over 200 years. You have a patient with some kind of damage in their brain, and you do very sophisticated behavioral tests to try to triangulate on what exactly is the deficit this person has. What can they do and what can they not do? So I asked Bob to draw a floor plan of the house he was living in, which he was in at that very moment that I asked him to draw the floor plan. And his sketch was shocking. There was no real organization to the sketch at all. Whole major rooms were left out. The rooms that were there didn't have any obvious spatial relationship to each other, and if they did, it bore no similarity to the actual layout of his house. Bob reported that sketching the floor plan was hard because he couldn't visualize any room that he wasn't in. He couldn't visualize the room adjacent to the room he was in, unless he went into it and saw it. Next, I asked Bob to draw a sketch of the immediate surroundings of his house. This produced a similar disaster, which bore no relationship to reality. Finally, I asked him to point to the Charles River, which is about 1.5 blocks from where we were at that moment, in his house that he'd lived in for many years. He had absolutely no idea what direction that was from us. Then I asked him to draw some complex multi-part objects, like a lobster and a bicycle. Bob's artistic skills are nothing amazing, to put it mildly. But the lobster and the bicycle had all the basic parts and all the correct relative position to each other, connected up the right way. So that weird and striking disconnect is a classic example of the power of the lesion method in neuropsychology. It can tell you the two different things that you would have thought would be just the same function, like the relative position of rooms in a house and the relative position of parts of an object. You would have thought, or many people, I would have thought, those would be all part of the same thing, but they're not. You can lose one and preserve the other. That's the power of the lesion method in neuropsychology. So the next morning, the neurosurgeon performed an 11-hour surgery and successfully removed the tumor from Bob's brain. Just 1 hour after the surgery was over, Bob was talking coherently to me. 2 days later, he went home. And very soon after, he went back to work. Today, many years later, Bob is doing just fine. He continues to be smart and funny and to work successfully at a fancy and demanding job. But now the key question: how are his navigational skills? What do you think? Sadly, they are not much improved, now many years after the surgery. And this outcome is consistent with lots of other findings in the field. Very often, when a patch of brain gets damaged in adulthood and people lose certain mental abilities, those abilities don't come back very much. It's as if the brain has already decided that that patch is where that function lives, and if you lose that patch, it can't move over to someplace else. Or maybe in adulthood, there's no else left over to move to. Everything's allocated. But this is an active, ongoing, and fascinating area of research with many complexities. For many brain regions, if you have damage to that region early in life, you can recover quite well. And the relevant functions can take up residence in some alternate location. And even in adulthood, some functions can recover after brain damage. But for many functions, like face recognition, navigation, or reading, if you lose that region in adulthood, you're pretty much screwed. It's pretty much just not going to come back in anything like its previous form. So today, Bob gets by just fine because he uses an iPhone with GPS to find his way around. If his medical situation had arisen 20 years ago, it would have been absolutely devastating. He couldn't leave a normal life. But hey, thank God for technology. So that's my story for you today. So of course, the reason to tell you that story is, one, it's a pretty amazing story. One of the most shocking and terrifying things that's ever happened to me. But also, it's so revealing of so many of the things that we're going to talk about in this course. So the first theme that emerges from this story is, why should we care about brains in the first place? The reason why it was so terrifying to discover a tumor in Bob's brain is not just that it might kill him. Like, that's bad enough. But you know, a heart problem could kill you too. It could also be life-threatening. But it wouldn't threaten your identity. The thing about the brain is, this is where the mind lives. This is who we are, right? So surgeons do heart transplants. They don't do brain transplants. And that's not just because heart transplants are easier. Brain transplants don't make any sense. If you took someone else's brain and you put it in your head, you'd be that other person more than you'd be yourself, right? Again, that's because the brain is who we are, right? So why do we have the decade of the brain a few years ago? Not the decade of the liver or the pancreas or the kidney. Those are all very fine organs. You need them to stay alive. But let's face it, they're not as cool as the brain. And that's, again, because the brain is who we are, right? So that's why I study the human brain. I want to know, what is this physical thing that is me? I mean, maybe some of the stuff we do will eventually be medically useful. I hope so. That would be awesome. That's not really my immediate goal. My immediate goal is to understand who we are as human beings. And so that's what we're going to focus on in this course, what the human brain tells us about who we are as human beings. Okay, that's the first theme. The second big point from the story is that the brain has structure. It's not just a bunch of amorphous mush. Different bits do different things. That's, of course, not news. People have been making that point in different ways for a couple hundred years now. But when Bob lost his navigational abilities, he didn't lose his ability to recognize faces, and his IQ didn't drop. So apparently, navigation functions as a distinct part of the brain. And because the brain is a physical implementation of the mind, basic parts of the brain are likely to also be parts of the mind. So a map of the functional organization of the brain is a kind of sketch of the major components of the human mind. Okay? So the fact that the brain has structure and parts is very good news for those of us who are trying to study it, because it makes possible one of the tried and true methods that's been applied in many different sciences to try to understand a complex thing, whether that's a car or a cell or a brain. And that method is to first figure out what the parts are, then try to figure out what each of them really does, and then maybe someday you can figure out how they're connected, how they work together, and how they produce the behavior of the thing you're studying. Spoiler alert, human cognitive neuroscience is much more successful at discovering the basic parts of the human brain than it is in doing any of those other things. So we'll spend a lot of time just on this basic first order question of what are those parts and what does each one do? And that's not because that's all there is to it. It's barely a beginning. That's because that's where human cognitive neuroscience has been most successful. We'll look at efforts to get beyond that. We'll do everything we can to show you results where people have managed to get beyond that. But just so you know, it's frankly pretty frustrating. I'm actually pretty cranky right now about the lack of methods that I need to answer the next pass questions that come after you get this basic map of the pieces. Not that we're done finding the pieces, just that we sort of have some ideas how to do that, much more than we have ideas how to answer the other questions. So the third theme of the course, illustrated in the story, is that some of those parts of the human mind and brain do extremely specific things. So we don't just have parts of the brain for big, broad functions, like remembering and reasoning and deciding. We have specific parts that do very particular things, like figuring out what direction you'd have to go to get from here to a familiar location. Okay, try this right now. Close your eyes. I mean it, close your eyes. I see some people are looking at me. I can tell. Close your eyes. While your eyes are still closed, try not to bump into your neighbor, but point to the student center, keeping your eyes closed. Okay, just keep them closed, keep pointing. Okay, keep pointing, but open your eyes while remaining pointing. Okay, look around. Okay, here you see individual differences in navigational ability. There's a vector average that's over there. It's pretty good, right? It's not noise. So that's something, and if you got it wrong, some of you are not from this campus, that would be one reason. Other people who get this wrong, a key insight of this course will be that ability is not correlated with IQ. So let yourself off the hook. If you absolutely suck at navigation or face recognition or lots of other things, it doesn't mean you're dumb. These are different in the brain. They're separate little machines in your brain, and you can be good at one of them and not good at others. Okay? We'll discuss that very ability to know how you're oriented with respect to other things in your known environment, because there are particular brain structures that do just that. Okay, a fifth key point is that to understand minds and brains, you need lots of different kinds of data. So my story mentioned just a few. So anatomical images, like the ones that first found the tumor in Bob's brain, and the ones that we found from my lab, that in my lab we use just to kind of get oriented before we do a functional scan. We need to know where we are, more or less. But as you can tell from my story, we don't know that well where we are. We didn't even see this big tumor there, right? So it's just rough landmarks for us. But they can be used to give you nice, detailed anatomical images of the brain. But you also have functional images, like the ones that Russell Epstein and I used to discover the parahippocampal place area in the first place. These are images that show you where the activity is in the brain. That's also done with an MRI machine, but it's a different kind of MRI. And of course, we have behavior, telling us what people can do and what they can't, and giving us lots of clues about how they do different things. Like when I asked Bob to sketch a floor plan of his house and compared that with his sketch of a bicycle or a lobster. In Bob's story, measuring behavior produced the big insight that you can have pretty much everything else in your mind working just fine, even if you have nearly completely lost your ability to navigate. And notice that that insight would last even if we didn't have any anatomical MRI images at all. So the whole first 200 years of the field of study of the brain, they didn't have brain imaging devices. They just tested people on their abilities. They couldn't see inside. They had no idea what was inside. But nonetheless, they discovered deep and cool things about which pieces were separable by discovering which things could be lost independently of which others. We'll spend a lot of time in this course thinking about what we can learn from each of the different methods in cognitive neuroscience, what are the strengths and weaknesses of each, and in particular, what kind of synergistic combinations of methods enable you to get around the serious limits that are present in any one of those methods alone. So here's a question for you to just give a shot at that. What are the different things that we learn if we show that part of the brain is active when you do a certain thing? Say, look at places and plan navigational routes in them, versus what do you learn when you see that someone with damage to the same region of the brain has lost their ability to do that thing? Are those two kinds of information, activation, for example, in a functional MRI image, and loss of function, for example, in Bob's case, are they redundant, telling us exactly the same thing, or complementary, or inconsistent, or totally unrelated? What do you think? Yes, I saw a nod over there. What do you think? What's your name?
Megan.
Hi. What do you think?
I don't. So I guess with the loss of the ability, I guess it's a more direct or like causal indication that that region is involved with that.
Bingo. Exactly. The key word is causal. And we'll talk about this much more, but the key thing is when you mess with a brain, or when the brain gets messed with one way or another, and you disrupt a function, that gives you a handle on the causal role of that bit of brain in that function, right? If you just see the thing turn on and off, when, turn on when people look at scenes and turn off when they look at other things, that's interesting. It's suggestive. If it's selective, it's very suggestive. But it doesn't tell you that that part of the brain is necessary for that function.